Well, to dispel any false expectations, I really am going to keep to very simple truths. The only justification is that these truisms are very widely rejected, often almost universally so, and the human consequences are quite severe, in particular with regard to the hard problems that I have in mind. One reason that they are hard is that moral truisms are so commonly disdained by those with sufficient power to do so with impunity because they set the rules. We've recently witnessed a dramatic illustration of how they set the rules. The last millennium ended, and this one opened, with a quite extraordinary display of self-adulation on the part of Western intellectuals who praised themselves and their leaders, and now quoting, for introducing a noble phase of foreign policy with a saintly glow as they adhered to principles and values for the first time in history, acting from pure altruism, following the lead of the idealistic new world bent on ending inhumanity, joined by its loyal partner, who alone comprehends the true nobility of the mission, which has now evolved further into the Bush Messianic mission to graft democracy onto the rest of the world. This is all quoted from the elite press and intellectuals at the kind of liberal end of the spectrum. The noblest achievement was a normative revolution in the 1990s, which established what was called a new norm in international affairs, the right of the self-designated enlightened states to resort to force to protect suffering people from evil monsters. Well, as anyone who knows history is aware, the rhetoric is not at all new. It was a constant refrain of European imperialism and the rhetorical flights of Japanese fascists, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, and other estimable figures were no less noble and quite possibly just as sincere, so internal documents indicate. The examples that were given to justify the course of self-adulation collapse on the slightest examination, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'd like to raise a different question bearing on how the rules are established. So here's a simple question. Why was the normative revolution in the decade of the 1990s and not, say, the 1970s, which actually is a much more reasonable candidate? The decade of the 1970s opened with the Indian invasion of East Pakistan, saving probably millions of lives. It closed with Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia, ousting the Khmer Rouge, just as their atrocities were peaking. The decade then was framed by two authentic cases of military intervention that terminated quite awesome crimes. Even if we were to accept the most extreme claims of the chorus of adulation for the leaders of the enlightened states in the 1990s, there is nothing that comes even close to the humanitarian consequences of the resorts to force that framed the decade of the 1970s. So that raises an obvious question. Why wasn't the decade of the 70s, why didn't that bring about a normative revolution with the foreign policy of the saviors basking in a saintly glow? Well, the answer is simplicity itself, but apparently unstateable. At least I've never seen a hint of it in the deluge of literature on this topic. The answer is that the interventions of the 1970s had two fundamental flaws. One is they were carried out by the wrong agents, them, not us. Second, both were bitterly denounced by the leader of the enlightened states, and the perpetrators of the crime of terminating genocide were harshly punished, particularly Vietnam, which was subjected to a U.S.-backed Chinese invasion to teach the criminals a lesson for bringing Pol Pot's crimes to an end, then severe sanctions, and direct U.S., British diplomatic and military support for the ousted Khmer Rouge. So it follows that the 1970s could not have brought about a normative revolution, and no one has ever suggested that it did. This illustrates the guiding principle. Norms are established by the powerful in their own interests and with the acclaim of responsible intellectuals. Actually, these may be close to historical universals. I've been looking for exceptions for many years, and they're not easy to find. Research project for you. Sometimes that principle is explicitly recognized. So the norm for post-World War II international justice was established at Nuremberg. And to bring the Nazi criminals to trial, to justice, it was necessary to devise definitions of war crime and crime against humanity. The Telford Taylor, who was the chief counsel for the prosecution and a distinguished international lawyer and historian, he has explained quite candidly how this was done. I'll quote him. Since both sides in World War II had played the terrible game of urban destruction, the Allies far more successfully, there was no basis for criminal charges against Germans or Japanese. And in fact, no such charges were brought. Aerial bombardment had been used so extensively and ruthlessly on the Allied side, as well as the Axis side, that neither at Nuremberg or Tokyo was the issue made a part of the trials. So that gives us the operational definition, the operative definition of crime. Crime is a crime that you carried out and we did not. And to underscore that fact, Nazi war criminals were absolved if the defense could show that their U.S. counterparts carried out the same crimes. Taylor concludes that to punish the foe, especially the vanquished foe, for conduct in which the enforcer nation has engaged would be so grossly inequitable as to discredit the laws themselves. That is correct, but the operative definition also discredits the laws themselves, along with every single subsequent tribunal. Taylor provides this background as part of his explanation of why U.S. bombing in Vietnam was not a war crime, and his argument is in fact plausible, further discrediting the laws themselves. Some of the subsequent tribunals are discredited in even more extreme ways. One is the Yugoslavia versus NATO case, which is now being adjudicated at the International Court of Justice. The U.S. was excused from that correctly on the basis of its argument that it is not subject to the jurisdiction of the court in this case. The reason is that when the U.S. signed the Genocide Convention after 40 years, and that's part of what is at issue here, the U.S. signed with a reservation stating that it is inapplicable to the United States, so therefore it's excused. In an outraged comment on the efforts of Justice Department lawyers to demonstrate that the president has the right to authorize torture, the dean of Yale Law School, Howard Koh, said that the notion that the president has the constitutional power to permit torture is like saying that he has the constitutional power to commit genocide. And in fact, the president's legal advisors should have little difficulty arguing that the president does indeed have that right. In fact, the new Attorney General, considered a moderate, has come quite close to that. He transmitted to the president the conclusion of the Justice Department that the president has the authority, constitutional authority, to rescind the Geneva Conventions, part of the supreme law of the land, and the foundation of modern humanitarian law. And he advised the president further that it would be wise to do so. Otherwise, he said, the president and his associates might be subject to prosecution under the War Crimes Act of 1996, which was passed by the Republican Congress and permits the death penalty for grave breaches of the conventions, which are indeed being carried out. It's interesting that there's no effort to conceal the fact that the U.S. is now carrying out grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. And just to remind you of some of the wording, the conventions state, quoting, that hospitals may in no circumstances be attacked, but shall at all times be respected and protected by the parties to the conflict. An attack on a hospital is a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, punishable by a death sentence under the War Crimes Act of 1996, and that means the highest commanders, that is, in the White House. We can turn to today's New York Times. Front page articles describe the success of the attack on Fallujah. One of the main achievements, it says, is that it shut down a propaganda weapon for the militants, Fallujah General Hospital, with its stream of reports of civilian casualties. How was this propaganda weapon shut down? Well, we can go back to the New York Times last Monday, front page story, which describes, I'm quoting it, that the hospital was attacked. Patients and hospital employees were rushed out of rooms by armed soldiers and ordered to sit or lie on the floor while troops tied their hands behind their backs. That's accompanied by a big picture on the front page, which I'm sure you saw, showing armed guards armed soldiers standing guard over patients and doctors lying or sitting on the floor with their hands tied behind their backs. So the world's greatest newspaper is telling us proudly that the president and his associates should face the death penalty under U.S. law. Of course, that's on an assumption, which is apparently too ludicrous to entertain, namely that our leaders are subject to U.S. laws, let alone international law, even when it's the supreme law of the land. Well, actually, there's much more to say about today's New York Times. Worth reading closely. I'll just keep to the front page stories. It describes how the U.S. military achieved nearly all of its objectives. It says much of the city lay in smoking ruins, and the U.S. must now rebuild what the conflict has just destroyed. Notice the conflict destroyed it. The conflict, kind of like a hurricane, has no agent, you know. It goes on to say that this ought to go down in the history books. That's what we read on page 1, and it's correct. And if we're capable of honesty, we know exactly on what page it will appear and who else will appear on that page. Even the details tell us a lot about ourselves if we choose to learn. So continuing with today's front page stories, they say that the mission was not a complete success. There's a mysterious absence of dead bodies of pack rats in their warrens or on the streets. Those are their words, not mine. There were some dead pack rats. A dead woman was found, but, to quote, it's not known if she was an Iraqi or a foreigner. That's the only question that's raised. Well, I'll stop there. You can go on, again, suggesting that you ask how this whole story should go down in the history books. But let's return to Nuremberg, which is described by distinguished figures in the field of international law and justice as the birth of universal jurisdiction, quoting Justice Richard Goldstone. The proper conclusion at Nuremberg and since would have been to punish the victors as well as the vanquished foe. But neither at the post-war trials nor subsequently have the powerful been subjected to the rules, and not because they have not carried out crimes, of course they have, but because they're immune under prevailing standards of morality among the enlightened. There is a marginal exception, which in fact underscores the force of the rule. Punishment is permissible when it's a tap on the wrist, evading the real crimes, or when blame can be restricted to minor figures, particularly, and this is crucial, when they're not like us. So, for example, it was considered proper to punish the soldiers who carried out the My Lai massacre, half-educated, half-crazed GIs in the field who didn't know who was going to be shooting at them next. But it was inconceivable that punishment could reach as far as those who planned and implemented Operation Wheeler Wallowa, huge mass murder operation to which My Lai was a very minor footnote. The trouble is that the gentlemen in the air-conditioned offices are like us, and therefore they're immune by definition. We're witnessing similar examples right now in Iraq. One moral truism that should be uncontroversial is the principle of universality. That is, we should apply to ourselves the same standards we apply to others, if we're serious, more stringent ones. But that seems to be virtually inexpressible, maybe unthinkable, including those in high places who tell us that they revere the words of Christ and surely have read, if not understood, his famous definition of the hypocrite. The common response of the intellectual culture, some memorable exceptions aside, is entirely natural if we abandon the most elementary of moral truisms and declare ourselves to be uniquely exempt from the principle of universality. And we do, constantly, without any notice. Every day brings new illustrations. So, for example, a couple of months ago, the U.S. Senate lent its consent to the appointment of John Negroponte as ambassador to Iraq, heading the world's largest diplomatic mission, with the task of handing over sovereignty to fulfill Bush's messianic vision to bring democracy to the Middle East and the world. So we are solemnly informed. The appointment bears directly on the principle of universality, but before turning to that, we might raise some questions about other truisms regarding evidence and conclusions. That the goal of the Iraq invasion was to fulfill the president's messianic vision is simply presupposed in news reporting and commentary, even among critics who warn that the noble and generous vision may be beyond our reach. With considerable search, I have not been able to find exceptions to this apart from the usual margins. Again, another research project for you. One might inquire into the apparently near universal acceptance of this doctrine in Western intellectual commentary. I think examination quickly reveals that it's based on two principles. First, our leaders have proclaimed it, so it must be true, just as in North Korea, for example. Second, we must suppress the fact that by proclaiming the doctrine after other pretexts have collapsed, our leaders are also declaring that they are accomplished liars, because in leading their countries to war, they proclaimed with comparable passion that the sole question, phrase that was used over and over, is whether Saddam has disarmed. But now we must believe them. Also obligatory is the dispatch deep into the memory hole of the ample record of professed noble efforts to bring democracy, justice, and freedom to the benighted. And again, it is the merest truism that professions of virtuous intent by leaders carry no information, even in the narrow technical sense. They're completely predictable, including the worst monsters, so they carry no information. But this truism fades when it confronts the overriding need to reject the principle of universality. The doctrine presupposed almost universally by Western commentary is accepted by some Iraqis too. 1%, according to U.S.-run polls, 1% in Baghdad agreed that the goal of the invasion is to bring democracy to Iraq. Another 5% felt that the goal is to help Iraqis. Most of the rest took for granted that the goal is to gain control over Iraq's resources and to use Iraq as a base for reorganizing the Middle East in U.S. interests. That's a thought that's virtually inexpressible in enlightened Western commentary, or dismissed with horror as anti-Americanism, conspiracy theory, radical and extremist, or some other intellectual equivalent of four-letter words among the vulgar. Well, that poll was a year ago. That was long before the atrocities last April and the revelations of torture and everything that's ensued. According to much more recent polls, at least 2/3 of Iraqis want U.S. forces to leave immediately, and a large majority of Americans believe that the United States should leave if Iraqis want us to. These are facts that don't enter into public discourse and, of course, electoral politics. In brief, Iraqis appear to take for granted that what's unfolding is a scenario that's quite familiar to them from the days of Britain's creation of modern Iraq, which was accompanied by the predictable and therefore uninformative professions of virtuous intent, but was also accompanied, as we now know, by secret internal documents released many decades later, in which Lord Curzon and the Foreign Office developed the plans to establish what they called an Arab facade that Britain would rule behind various constitutional fictions. The contemporary version is provided by a senior British official who says that the Iraqi government will be fully sovereign, but in practice it will not exercise all of its sovereign functions. If you want an American counterpart to that, have a look at a front page story in yesterday's New York Times in the Week in Review. There's a think piece on our dilemmas in pursuing the president's messianic vision to bring democracy to the Middle East. The first paragraph of the story tells us, quoting it, that the post-Arafat era will be the latest test of a quintessentially American article of faith, that elections provide legitimacy even to the frailest institutions. Go down to the last paragraph on the continuation page, and there we read that the United States resisted national elections among Palestinians because Arafat would win a fresh mandate and elections might give credibility to Hamas. So we see the operative definition of the quintessential article of faith. Democracy is fine if the outcome conforms to our demands, otherwise to the flames, as in Iraq now and under the British, Iran, Guatemala, Brazil, Chile, Nicaragua, Haiti, a long string of other cases which we're somehow supposed to forget. Iraqis, in fact, know us better than we choose to know ourselves. And I stress the word choose because the data are right on the surface and in abundance. So we choose not to know. And in fact, it's not unusual for those who are at the wrong end of the club to have a better picture of reality than the ones who are wielding it. Another case. Well, let's return to Negroponte and the principle of universality. As his appointment reached Congress, the Wall Street Journal had a big article, correct one, praising him as what they called a modern proconsul who learned his trade in Honduras in the 1980s. That's during the Reaganite phase of the current incumbents in Washington. It was written by a veteran journal correspondent, Carla Ann Robbins, who reminds us that in Honduras, Negroponte was known as the proconsul, as he presided over the largest CIA station in the world in this centerpiece of world power. Robbins observes that Negroponte has been criticized by human rights activists for covering up abuses by the Honduran military. That's a euphemism for large-scale state terror. The purpose of the cover-up, she continues, was to ensure the flow of U.S. aid to Honduras, still quoting, which was the base for Washington's covert war against Nicaragua. And in fact, the main task of Proconsul Negroponte was to supervise the bases in which the terrorist mercenary army was armed, trained, sent to do its work, including its mission of attacking undefended civilian targets. So the U.S. military command informed Congress, confirmed by the State Department. Negroponte's primary task as proconsul in Honduras was to supervise the international terrorist atrocities for which the United States was condemned by the World Court in a judgment that reached well beyond Nicaragua's narrow case. It was shaped by a Harvard legal team led by a distinguished Harvard international law specialist. They shaped it to avoid factual debate. So they just kept to the facts that had already been conceded. But the court in its decision went well beyond. The court ordered Washington to terminate the crimes and to pay substantial reparations. All of this was ignored on the official grounds, I'm now quoting the State Department legal advisor, that other nations do not agree with us, so we must reserve to ourselves the power to determine how we will act and which matters fall essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States as determined by the United States. In this case, the actions that the court condemned as unlawful use of force, which is in lay terms international terrorism, all of this is consigned to the ash can of history by the educated classes in the usual manner of unwanted truths, along with the two Security Council resolutions affirming the court judgment and vetoed by the United States. The international terrorist campaign received passing mention during Negroponte's confirmation hearings, but was considered of no particular significance thanks to the exemption of our glorious selves from the principle of universality. Well, let's move on to some hard problems. Perhaps none is more prominent today than quoting the evil scourge of terrorism, particularly state-backed international terrorism, a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself in a return to barbarism in the modern age. That's how the plague was described in Washington when the war on terror was declared. That was not on September 2001 when it was redeclared, but rather 20 years earlier by the same people and their mentors. Their war on terror instantly turned into a murderous terrorist war with horrifying consequences in Central America, the Middle East, Southern Africa, and elsewhere. But that's only history, not the history crafted by its custodians in the enlightened states. In the more useful, accepted history, the 1980s are described by scholarship as the decade of, I'm quoting, persistent state involvement or sponsorship of terrorism, especially by Libya and Iran. The U.S. merely responded with a proactive stance toward terrorism, and the same was true of its allies, Israel, South Africa, the clandestine terror network assembled by the Reaganites that included Argentine neo-Nazis, Taiwan, Britain, and others. I'll put to the side the radical Islamists who were organized and trained for the cause, not to defend Afghanistan, which would have been a legitimate goal, but to bloody the official enemy, probably prolonging the Afghan war and leaving the country in ruins, soon to become worse as Western clients took over with subsequent consequences that we don't have to go into. Gone from acceptable history are millions of victims of the real war on terror in the 1980s, and those who are trying to survive in what is left of their devastated lands. Also out of history is the residual culture of terror, which domesticates the aspirations of the majority. Quoting the survivors of the Jesuit intellectual community in El Salvador in a conference surveying the actual but unacceptable history. It would only be fair to say that it's not entirely out of history. So a few days ago, Donald Rumsfeld visited El Salvador to thank the client regime that the U.S. installed by violence for sending a few hundred soldiers to Iraq. And he held up, quoting him, he held up El Salvador as a nation that understands well the human struggle for liberty and democracy. That was in a ceremony honoring U.S. and Salvadoran soldiers, that is, the security forces that were held responsible by El Salvador's Truth Commission for the overwhelming majority of the 70,000 people killed and the innumerable other atrocities carried out during the vicious decade of the 1980s, which was opened by the assassination of a conservative archbishop who had become a voice for the voiceless, and ended in 1989 with the assassination of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals and their housemaid and her daughter by an elite battalion armed and trained by the United States, which had already compiled a hideous record of slaughter of the usual victims. The U.S. still takes no chances. El Salvador had what's called a free election last March to ensure that the democratic vote would come out the right way. The Bush administration warned that if it did not, the U.S. might cut the country's economic life support. That's remittances from people fleeing to the United States to survive, along with other consequences that are familiar to the population. Iraqis would evidently not be surprised to learn that this is the kind of democracy that Washington has in mind for them, the quintessential faith, as the world's greatest newspaper explained to us yesterday. Returning to terrorism, it does pose a number of hard problems. First and foremost, of course, the phenomenon itself, which really is threatening, even if we keep to the subpart that passes through the doctrinal filters, that is their terrorism against us. It's only a matter of time before terror and weapons of mass destruction are united, perhaps with horrendous consequences. That's been discussed in the technical literature long before 9/11, but in fact it was obvious since 1993, when the first effort to destroy the World Trade Center almost succeeded, carried out by same jihadis that had been organized and trained by the United States. But apart from the phenomenon, which is bad enough, there's the problem of the definition of terror. That too is taken to be a hard problem. It's the subject of a lot of scholarly literature, international conferences, and so on. Well, at first glance, it might seem odd that it's regarded as a hard problem. There are what seem to be satisfactory definitions, not perfect, it's not logic, but at least as good as other terms that are regarded as quite unproblematic. For example, there are the official definitions in the U.S. Code and Army manuals in the early 1980s when the War on Terror was launched, or the quite similar official formulation of the British government, which defines terrorism as the use or threat of action which is violent, damaging, or disrupting, and is intended to influence the government or intimidate the public for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, or ideological cause. Sounds reasonable. Those are the definitions that I've been using in writing about terrorism for the past 20 years, ever since the Reagan administration declared that the war on terror would be a prime focus of U.S. foreign policy, replacing human rights, which was the proclaimed soul of our foreign policy before. Well, on closer look, the problem becomes clear, and it is indeed hard. The official definitions are unusable because of their immediate consequences. One difficulty is that the definition of terrorism is virtually the same as the definition of the official policy of the United States and other states, which is called counterterrorism, or low-intensity warfare, or some other euphemism. That, again, is close to a historical universal, to my knowledge. I've looked at a lot of cases. So take, say, Japan, Japanese fascism. Japanese imperialists in Manchuria and North China were not aggressors or terrorists. They were protecting the population and the legitimate governments from the terrorism of Chinese bandits, much as the United States is now protecting the legitimate government it installed in Iraq from revenge-minded anti-Iraqi terrorists. So the New York Times informs us in today's front page story, normal description. Going back to Japan, to undertake their noble task, Japanese fascists were compelled reluctantly to resort to counterterror with the goal of establishing an earthly paradise in which the people of Asia could live in peace and harmony under the enlightened guidance of Japan. And the same is true of just about every other case that I've investigated. But now we do face a hard problem. It simply will not do to say that the enlightened states are officially committed to terrorism. And it takes little effort to demonstrate that the U.S. engages in large-scale international terrorism according to its own definition of the term, quite uncontroversially in a number of crucial cases. And there are related problems. Some of them arose when the United Nations General Assembly, in response to Reaganite pressures, passed its strongest condemnation of terrorism in December 1987, with a call on all states to destroy the plague of the modern age. The resolution passed 153 to 2, with only Honduras abstaining. The two states that opposed the resolution explained their reasons in the UN debate. They objected to a passage, which I'll read, recognizing the right to self-determination, freedom, and independence as derived from the Charter of the United Nations of people forcibly deprived of that right, particularly peoples under colonial and racist regimes and foreign occupation. Well, the term colonial and racist regimes was understood to refer to South Africa, a U.S. ally, resisting the attacks of Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, one of the world's more notorious terrorist groups, as Washington determined at the same time. And foreign occupation was understood to refer to Washington's Israeli client. So not surprisingly, the United States and Israel alone voted against the resolution, which was therefore effectively vetoed, in fact, subjected to the usual double veto when the U.S. is against it, inapplicable, and vetoed from reporting and history as well, although it is the strongest and most important UN resolution on terrorism. So there is a hard problem of defining terrorism, rather like the problem of defining war crime. How can we define it to violate the principle of universality, exempting ourselves but applying to selected enemies? And it becomes even harder because the enemies have to be selected with some precision. So the United States has an official list of states sponsoring terrorism. It's been for over 20 years. In all of these years, only one state has been removed from the list, namely Iraq, in order to permit the current incumbents in Washington and their immediate mentors to provide aid to their friend Saddam Hussein, including help in developing weapons of mass destruction, that continued without any concern after he carried out his most horrifying crimes, long after the war with Iran ended, contrary to a lot of pretexts, and in fact for reasons that they were kind enough to explain. So the Bush administration explained that This was beneficial to U.S. exporters, and in 1991, when they authorized Saddam to crush the Shiite rebellion that might have overthrown him, the conclusion was that his rule contributed to stability, as the New York Times favorably explained administration thinking. Stability is another euphemism which refers to U.S. domination. The idea that Iraqis might rule Iraq has never been acceptable and still is not. There has been one near example of a country removed from the list of states sponsoring terrorism. Clinton offered to remove Syria if it agreed to peace terms offered by the United States and Israel. When Syria insisted on recovering the territory that Israel conquered in 1967, it remained on the list of states sponsoring terrorism, which is another indication of how seriously the list is taken. And it continues to be on the list in spite of the acknowledgement by Washington that Syria has been highly cooperative in providing important intelligence to the United States on al-Qaeda and other radical Islamic groups, which it detests. As a reward for Syria's cooperation in the war on terror, last December, Congress passed legislation calling for even stricter sanctions against Syria, near unanimously. The legislation was later implemented by the President, thus depriving the United States of a major source of information about radical Islamist terrorism in order to achieve the higher goal of establishing in Syria a regime that will accept U.S.-Israeli demands. It's not an unusual pattern, although commentators constantly find it surprising that no matter how strong the evidence and how regular the pattern, and no matter how rational the choices in terms of clear and understandable planning priorities, and among them preventing terror ranks quite low, as this and other dramatic current examples illustrate. Well, when Saddam was removed from the list of states supporting terrorism in 1982, there was a gap, so Cuba was added to replace it. That was perhaps in recognition of the sharp escalation in international terrorist attacks against Cuba in the late 1970s, including the bombing of a Cubana airliner, killing 73 people, and many other atrocities. These were mostly planned and implemented in the United States, although by that time Washington had moved away from its former policy of direct action in bringing the terrors of the earth to Cuba. Phrase is Arthur Schlesinger's. It was the goal of the Kennedy administration, reported by Schlesinger, historian and Kennedy advisor, correctly. Plenty of documentation about it. By the late 1970s, Washington was officially condemning the terrorist acts while harboring and protecting the terrorist cells on U.S. soil in violation of U.S. law, as it indeed still does. The leading terrorist, Orlando Bosch, is regarded as the author of the Cubana airliner bombing and dozens of other terrorist acts, according to the FBI. He was given a presidential pardon by George Bush #1 over the strong objections of the Justice Department, which wanted him deported as a threat to U.S. security. Others like him continue to operate with impunity on U.S. soil, including terrorists responsible for major crimes elsewhere, for whom the U.S. refuses requests for extradition from Haiti, for example, where one of the leading terrorists lives not too far from here quite happily. We may, and the U.S. just refuses requests for extradition, and it's considered so ridiculous that it's not even reported. We may recall one of the leading components of the Bush doctrine. I'm now talking about Bush #2. Quote, "Those who harbor terrorists are as guilty as the terrorists themselves and must be treated accordingly." Those were the president's words when he announced the bombing of Afghanistan because of its refusal to turn over suspected terrorists to the United States without evidence, and in fact without credible pretext, as was later quietly conceded. In what's sometimes called a tripolar, the Harvard University's international relations specialist, Graham Allison, describes this as the most important component of the Bush Doctrine, which, in his words, unilaterally revoked the sovereignty of states that provide sanctuary to terrorists. Wrote that in Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal. And he added that the doctrine has already become a de facto rule of international relations. Unreconstructed literalists might conclude that Bush and Allison are calling for the bombing of the United States. But that's because they don't understand that the most elementary moral truisms must be forcefully rejected. There's a crucial exemption to the principle of universality, so deeply entrenched in the reigning intellectual culture that it's not perceived and hence not mentioned. Sometimes a denial of moral truisms is quite explicit. Case in point is the reaction to the second major component of the Bush Doctrine, which was formally enunciated, as you know, in the National Security Strategy of September 2002, which declared Washington's right to resort to force to eliminate any potential challenge to its global dominance. That was very widely criticized among the foreign policy elite, but on rather narrow grounds. Not that it was wrong, but that the style and implementation were so extreme that they posed threats to U.S. interests. Henry Kissinger described, quoting him, the new approach as revolutionary, pointing out that it undermines the 17th century Westphalian system of international order and, of course, the UN Charter and international law. He approved of the doctrine, but with reservations about style and tactics, the usual ones. He also added a crucial qualification. He said, it cannot be a universal principle available to every nation. Rather, the right of aggression must be reserved to the United States, perhaps delegated to chosen clients. We must forcefully reject the most elementary of moral truisms, the principle of universality. And Kissinger is, in fact, to be praised for his honesty in forthrightly articulating prevailing doctrine, which is usually concealed in professions of virtuous intent and tortured legalisms. As Kissinger understood, the question of universality does arise at once. If the United States is authorized to bomb another country, say to compel its leaders to turn over someone it suspects of involvement in a terrorist act, then a fortiori, Cuba, Nicaragua, in fact a host of others, are entitled to bomb the United States because there is no doubt of its involvement in very serious terrorist acts against them. In the case of Cuba, going back 45 years, extensively documented in impeccable sources and not questioned. In the case of Nicaragua, even condemned by the World Court and the Security Council in vetoed resolutions, after which the U.S. escalated the attack. This conclusion surely follows if we accept the principle of universality. The conclusion, of course, is utterly outrageous and advocated by no one. We therefore conclude once again that the principle of universality has a crucial exception, and that rejection of elementary moral truisms is so deeply entrenched that even raising the question is an unspeakable abomination. The Iraq War has been considered more controversial, so there is an extensive professional literature debating whether it satisfies international law and the famous just war criteria, which have the interesting property that nothing follows from them, nothing, unless you add the ubiquitous phrase, I believe, at the relevant points. We'll go into that interesting topic. One distinguished scholar from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, actually a highly recognized human rights activist, exponent of human rights law, he argues forthrightly that international law is simply, in his words, hot air and should be abandoned because state practice does not conform to its meaning. It does not conform to it. Okay, what does that mean? That means the United States and its allies ignore it. And there's a further defect of international law and the UN Charter, he argues. They limit the capacity of the United States to resort to force, and such resort is right and good because the United States leads the enlightened states, his phrase. Apparently, by definition, no evidence or argument is adduced and apparently not considered necessary. Another respected scholar in the American Journal of International Law argues that the U.S. and Britain were in fact acting in accord with the UN Charter when they invaded Iraq under what he calls a communitarian interpretation of its provisions, with appropriate references to Habermas and other distinguished figures. They were carrying out the will of the international community in a mission that was implicitly delegated to them because they alone had the power to carry it out. And it's apparently irrelevant that the international community vociferously objected at an absolutely unprecedented level. Quite evidently, if people are included within the international community, but even among elites in this case. Others observe that law is a living instrument. Its meaning is determined by practice, and practice demonstrates that new norms have been established permitting what's called anticipatory self-defense. It's another euphemism for aggression at will. The tacit assumption is that norms are established by the powerful, and they alone have the right to anticipatory self-defense. For example, no one would argue that Japan exercised this right when it bombed military bases in the U.S. colonies of Hawaii and the Philippines, even though the Japanese knew very well that B-17 flying fortresses were coming off the Boeing production line, and they were surely familiar with the very public discussions in the United States explaining how they could be used to incinerate Japan's wooden cities in a war of extermination, flying from Hawaiian and Philippine bases. And notice that that argument is far more powerful than justification for the bombing than anything produced by Bush or Blair. Nor would anyone accord that right to any state today, apart from the self-declared enlightened states, which have the power to determine norms and to apply them selectively at will, basking in praise for their generosity, nobility, and messianic visions of righteousness. There's nothing particularly novel about any of this, apart from one aspect. The means of destruction that have been developed are by now so awesome, and the risks of deploying and using them so enormous, that a rational Martian observer would not rank the prospects for survival of this curious species very high, as long as contempt for elementary moral truisms remains so deeply entrenched among educated elites. Just one more sentence. Yes, let's add that this is my first, last, and only contribution to moral philosophy. Sure.
Professor Chomsky will take a couple of questions till about 8:45. Is there someone standing at that mic?
I'll just alternate the mics.
It's been turned on, but
no. Yeah, I can hear you. Can other people hear him?
Okay.
I'll repeat the question.
It's a short question. I just want to know what you think about the recent news about the CIA purge and how significant that is. And also, actually, another little note. I've read that upwards of 80,000 people, there's been 80,000 Iraqi casualties in the war. I'm just wondering what you think about that statistic, because I know you probably read about it a lot.
Well, on the CIA purge, I have nothing to say. I mean, if they want to purge each other.
Well, just like historically? I mean,
historically? I mean, we really don't know. I don't think anybody knows.
Okay.
So it's whatever it is. On the casualties, the figure's 100,000. That was there was an article in the
Slate ran a piece like a few days ago that I forgot the author, but this guy was saying that it was way below 80,000, and then I read a whole bunch of articles that said it was way above.
Here's the background. There was an article in the Lancet, which is the world's major medical newspaper, of a careful study carried out by the Johns Hopkins and Columbia University by experts in their schools of public health, which did an extensive household survey over Iraq very carefully, and they estimated, they extrapolated in the standard way to estimate the likely number of casualties, and the highest probability was around 100,000. There's a spread, of course, there has to be. The spread is extended by the fact that in order to err on the conservative side, they included the Kurdish areas, where there were essentially no casualties because there was no fighting, and of course that extends the spread, lowers the confidence levels. And they excluded Fallujah, which would have raised the casualty level very high, not only Fallujah, but the whole Anbar area where most of the casualties are. So their conclusion, which is plausible, is that the 100,000 range estimate is the most probable, probably on the conservative side. And they compare it with the number of deaths before and show it's going way up and so on. That's the background. In England, there was enough publicity about this so that the government had to make a response. And the response was that they didn't accept the methodology because it was based on extrapolation, like every existing study, but we'll put that aside. In the United States, there was no need to give a response because the issue, it was mentioned, but then it died. Okay, killed 100,000 Iraqis. Let's go on to a more interesting topic. And there have been some pretty ridiculous criticisms of it, which have been answered, but it's not worth going into them. Whether that number is correct or not, we don't know. Maybe it's twice as high. Maybe it's half as high. Okay, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood is the current best guess.
Hi, I'm part of a student campaign on campus here at NYU, and we're trying to stop the sale and distribution of Coca-Cola products in response to human rights violations and paramilitary violence in and around Coca-Cola bottling plants in Colombia. We have a petition here if you're interested in signing. We'd love for you to come by after the talk right here. But Mr. Chomsky, I was interested on your thoughts on the situation in Colombia, particularly U.S. involvement in things such as Plan Colombia, and also the effectiveness of student campaigns such as ours. And yeah.
Yeah, I understand. Well, actually, it's very close to home. Just 2 days ago, I had over at our house a visitor who's actually my daughter's is a Latin Americanist involved very much in Colombian affairs. She's been working with indigenous Colombian mine workers, and one of them had to flee Colombia because after his fourth assassination attempt, he couldn't stay there any longer, left his family and staying there. It was over at our house the other night. But I've been there. I've been in the southern part where some of the worst atrocities are being carried out. Colombia, by any standard, has by far the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere through the 1990s. And it's far and away the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training, which is incidentally going up. Even by the State Department's estimates, roughly 70% or roughly of the major atrocities, which are horrible, are carried out either by the state or the paramilitaries, who are so closely integrated with the state authorities that Human Rights Watch just calls them the 6th division of the Colombian Army. Army has 5 official divisions, and good neoliberal style is privatizing atrocities to the paramilitaries. Actually, the U.S. is also privatizing its atrocities, so the chemical warfare that's being carried out there, which is carried out under the euphemism of fumigation, but it's actually chemical warfare, driving peasants off their land and so on. It's not carried out by the U.S. Army. It's carried out by what are called private corporations, like DynCorp, made up of U.S. military officers who don't have to answer to Congress for the limited human rights conditions. Same's going on in Iraq. I think the private U.S. mercenary army of DynCorp and others is the second biggest contingent there outside the United States, if I recall correctly. But that's good neoliberal practice. You privatize atrocities. Colombia, just speaking of union workers alone, and this is what the Coca-Cola case is about. Last year, more union activists were killed in Colombia than the entire rest of the world put together. And furthermore, that's been going on for some years. Some of it has to do with a plant owned by a Coca-Cola subordinate, where a lot of atrocities took place. Under the initiative of the United Steelworkers, a case was brought in a Florida court against Coca-Cola, and to everyone's surprise, it was a partial victory. That is, the court decided that the subsidiary of Coca-Cola could be charged, but not Coca-Cola, which is a lot better than anyone expected. Where that'll go through the courts, I don't know. But it is, it's not just union activists. I mean, there's a long history there. The fact that Colombia is both the leading human rights violator in the Western Hemisphere by substantial measure and far and away the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training right through the Clinton years and today, that's normal. There's a very well-supported correlation carried out in the best academic literature and so on between human rights violations and U.S. military aid and training. In fact, U.S. aid generally goes right through the Carter years and so on. It's understandable why. I mean, there's some good studies on it if you're interested. The best studies are done by occasional co-author of mine, Edward Herman, who's the Wharton School economist at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He carried out one of the most detailed studies of the correlation between U.S. aid and torture worldwide, very high correlation. But he also carried out a second study, which is much more enlightening. He studied the correlation between U.S. aid and what's called a favorable climate for business operations, like the ability to repatriate profits and things like that. And there he found a very close correlation. And that explains the first correlation. I mean, it's not that the U.S. likes torture. It just doesn't care. What it likes is favorable climates for business operations, and that makes perfectly good sense. And it happens that one of the best ways to improve the climate for business operations is to murder union leaders, to torture priests who are working with peasants, to kill human rights activists, things like that. So you get a kind of a secondary correlation, which has been documented, namely the correlation between human rights violations and atrocities and U.S. aid. Doesn't bother anybody. I'm sure you haven't read about it. Again, for the usual reasons. We're exempt from any such conditions, because we so declare, and we have the power to enforce it, so it's not discussed, and so on. And yeah, things like these activities, decide what's the right tactic for you. There are a lot of things to do, but it's the right kind of activity. There's nothing other than popular action that can bring about any change in this.
Thanks for coming tonight, Noam. You've been writing for, well, he doesn't make it to New York every day, You've been writing about...
Hey, he doesn't count because I wrote a recommendation for his admission.
Well, you've been writing... You didn't have to tell everybody. You've been writing for a long time about the contempt for elementary moral truisms by the educated elite. In fact, I think your essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, was based on lectures you gave here at NYU in 1968. So, as you know, my interest has a lot to do with the media. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit about some of the reactions by the educated elite to the propaganda model, a theory you wrote with Edward Herman, including those by Nicholas Leaman and Walter Lefebvre, and most recently in a journal called Political Communication, published out of England. I think it goes a lot along the lines even for here, though, because even in tonight's introductory speech, there's about 2 sentences about your political work and a lot more to say about your linguistics. So could you maybe speak to why you think, particularly in the U.S., educated elites have these kind of problems?
Well, first of all, it's not particularly in the U.S. I think it's universal. In fact, as far as I can see, you can find some exceptions for me, but as far as I can see, it goes back to the origins of recorded history. Who drank the hemlock in Athens? A guy who was supporting power, or a guy who was corrupting the youth by asking embarrassing questions. If you go back to the Bible, you could go back to the Bible, which we're supposed to revere, especially Bush and Blair and those people. There were people who are what we would call dissident intellectuals. The term that's used for them is prophet, but that's just a bad translation of a Hebrew word of unknown origin. I mean, they were in fact what we call dissident intellectuals. They were doing geopolitical analysis, criticizing the king, saying he's going to bring disaster, calling for, help for widows and orphans, and all sorts of things like that. How were they treated? Okay, well, we have the biblical record. They were imprisoned, driven into the desert, despised, and so on. King Ahab, who's the epitome of evil in the Bible, as you know, if you know the Bible, he called one of them to him, Elijah, and asked him, "Why are you a hater of Israel?" That's the origin, I think, of the term anti-Americanism. Elijah was a hater of Israel because he was criticizing the king. And in true totalitarian fashion, the king identifies himself with Israel, just as anyone who criticizes U.S. government policy is anti-American by the same totalitarian doctrine. On the other hand, there were plenty of intellectuals, called prophets also, who were treated very nicely. They were the flatterers at the court, And centuries later, many centuries later, the values were reversed. And now you're supposed to honor the prophets and condemn the false prophets, but that's not the way it was at the time. And if there's an exception to this practice to the present, I've yet to find it. So I don't think that the United States is out of the standard spectrum on this. On the criticisms that you mentioned, I just did not talk about them. Actually, I've written about them. So if you want, you can look at what I've written. But I don't think it's appropriate for me to, make criticisms of the individuals without going into the details. Propaganda model was so-called, which is mostly Edward Herman's work, I should say, this same economist at Penn. That's just been dismissed. And it's basically truisms. What it is just a simple analysis of the institutional structure of the media, of the kind that's done in any serious social science, with some elementary predictions about what you'd expect the immediate product to be. And then it's mostly just, by now, thousands of pages of documentation, testing the predictions under the harshest conditions we can think of. And as far as I know, they've come out pretty well. Nobody's questioned any of them, none. Just kind of screaming occasionally. But so it seems to me an elementary conclusion of social science, and probably one of the best supported, but disregarded. Can't accept it. And if you want some serious discussion of it, there is some. The most serious discussion I know is in Britain's leading Journal of International Affairs, the Review of International Policy, I think it's called, which does have a special issue devoted to this, and also discussing the question why this conception can't be discussed. Pardon? Why can't it be done here? Because it's mostly about the United States. I mean, look, when I go to Canada, for example, and give talk, if I'm critical of the United States, they love it. If I'm critical of Canada, sometimes they won't even pay my airfare. They're so curious. I mean, it's the way it works. Yeah.
I have two short questions about neoconservatives. The first thing is about Turkey's hopefully will be joining the EU in December. And my question is, it's 25 countries now plus Turkey, which is a very important, if you want to use American terminology, ally in the Middle East for the EU. I think, and the way Turkey is democratizing, even though under an Islamic leadership, I think that, kind of undermines neoconservative ideology regarding democratization used by military force. I mean, here you have Turkey democratizing, or at least, in considerable measures, and I would like to know what do you think about that. And my second question is, you were talking a lot about, the 70s and the 80s, and it seemed that neoconservatives are not something totally new, are more like a ideology which is affiliated with this kind of policy which is already continuing for a few decades. So I'd like to know what you think.
Like 200 years. It goes back to, for example, the first executive war in the United States in violation of the Constitution was in 1818 when Andrew Jackson conquered Florida in a big massacre, which was approved in a famous state paper by John Quincy Adams, who gave the justification for executive war without constitutional approval, and every war since then has been like that, which incidentally doesn't bother strict constructionists at all, interestingly. So yes, it's an old policy. It goes back to actually before the colonies. The neocons is a little bit of a joke, I think. There is a group of people called neoconservatives. I don't think they have any power. If the positions they advocate happen to conform to those of authentic power, okay, they're influential. If you take a look at their recommendations through the 90s, which everybody talks about, a lot of them were kind of like off the chart, and they were just disregarded. With regard to Turkey, Turkey fits the pattern that I described before of violence and military aid almost perfectly. Turkey was the leading recipient of U.S. military aid in the 1990s. That's apart from Israel and Egypt, which are a separate category. It was the leading recipient. In 1999, it was replaced by Colombia as the leading recipient. Why was it the leading recipient? Because it was carrying out huge atrocities in the southeast against the Kurdish population, 12, 15 million people. That meant during the 1990s, maybe 3 million people driven out of their homes, 3,500 villages devastated, tens of thousands of people killed, every imaginable form of barbarism. I've been there a couple of times, in fact. All very well documented, Human Rights Watch reports and so on. Clinton was pouring aid in. As atrocities escalated, aid kept up with it. In fact, in the single year, 1997, Clinton sent more aid to Turkey than through the whole Cold War period combined up to the onset of the counterinsurgency campaign. Well, obviously that can't be reported here. So you don't read reports of it in the New York Times or anywhere else. You got to search for it. But it's easy to find, like Human Rights Watch reports and other things. By 1999, the counterinsurgency campaign had succeeded. So Colombia replaced Turkey as the leading recipient of military aid because their counterinsurgency campaign hadn't succeeded. Actually, Turkey had replaced El Salvador when its campaign more or less succeeded. And then it goes on. There was a very interesting case involving the so-called neocons in 2003. You'll recall in the year 2003, there was quite a remarkable episode which tells us a lot about ourselves. A distinction was made between what was called New Europe and Old Europe. Okay, Old Europe is the bad guys, France and Germany and those. New Europe is the good guys, the hope of the future, the forefront of the new democracies and so on. That was Berlusconi in Italy, Aznar in Spain, and so on. And there was a criterion, a sharp criterion that distinguished the good guys from the bad guys. The France and Germany and the other bad guys, in those countries, the government took the same position as the large majority of the population. So they're bad guys. In the other countries, like Spain and Italy, the governments overrode an even larger percentage of the population, ignored it, like in Spain around 90%, and followed orders from Crawford, Texas. So they were the hope of the future, you know. And this was not just Donald Rumsfeld. This was the entire discussion. Turkey was a very interesting example. To everyone's surprise, mine too, the Turkish government took the same position as 95% of the population. Okay, they were bitterly denounced. They were condemned for lacking what were called democratic credentials, literally. The most extreme condemnation was by the man who was identified as the idealist in chief of the administration, Washington Post's phrase, leading the crusade for democracy, Paul Wolfowitz. He went so far as to condemn the Turkish military because they didn't intervene as they could to prevent the government from following the will of 95% of the population. And he instructed them that they should apologize to the United States. Okay, he was then designated idealist in chief, leading the messianic vision, etc. All of this is right in public. You know, it's not correct that Turkey. I mean, the whole business of Islamic and not Islamic is totally irrelevant to anything. But the facts of the matter are with Turkey that it was a secular state. I mean, there's a new government which is kind of moderate Islamist, but it's been, you know, secular ever since Ataturk.
Mr. Chomsky, I know there are other questions, but I think it's time to bring this part to a close with, again, reminding us that we have been listening, in Professor Stephen Schaeffer's words, to our great dissident and our prophet. Thank you very much.